Welcome to Carbon Connection, the podcast bringing you the latest insights from the front lines of climate action. I'm Lauren Napuck with the Climate Action Reserve, and together we'll hear from industry leaders driving real progress against climate change and explore the ever-evolving world of carbon markets and climate policy. Thanks for joining, and let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Carbon Connection. Today, I'm excited to be joined by my fantastic colleague, Amy Kessler, the Reserve's Director of Latin America. Many of you likely know Amy for her incredible work in advancing carbon markets across Latin America, including overseeing the development, implementation, and expansion of our protocols and programs in the region. I'm thrilled to dive into these efforts with Amy today, especially the exciting new partnerships formed in Latin America and the Caribbean, and the positive impact these initiatives are having on local communities and ecosystems. Amy, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Lauren. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you, and Amy, it's even more exciting to have you as the last time we spoke was actually during the first season of Carbon Connection, where our work in the Latin American region was only in Mexico at the time when you and I had spoke. So I'm wondering, to kick things off, if you can share what some of the most significant updates to the Latin America and Caribbean program have been over the past years.
Great. Thanks, Lauren. There have been many exciting developments in the region in the last couple of years, as well as continued growth in Mexico specifically. We published a livestock protocol for the Dominican Republic last October. That was the first protocol adaptation we completed, which was supported by Mexico Cerdos and had participation from the Ministries of Environment and Agriculture and the DR, as well as other local stakeholders and experts in livestock methodologies. We then completed both forest protocol adaptations for Guatemala and Panama in January 2024. We worked very closely with the Ministry of Environment in Panama, Mi Ambiente, and the development of the forest protocol there, which was funded by the Latin American Development Bank. For that protocol, we also had a very robust work group of stakeholders in Panama, including from the comarcas or indigenous communities in Panama. And likewise, for the Guatemala forest protocol, we had a great work group of experts with local stakeholder engagement and involvement from potential project developers, verifiers, and the nonprofit sector. Lastly, in March of this year, we launched the Argentina Livestock Protocol, which recently completed public comment review and will go to our board of directors for adaptation October 2nd. While that protocol was initially driven by the province of Córdoba, we were fortunate to also have participation from the national government and other provinces in the work group, as well as a number of other experts in the livestock sector in Argentina. And lastly, I'll note that on the Mexico side of things, we have continued to see a lot of growth, particularly under the forest protocol. Also, more recently, the landfill, halocarbons, and livestock protocols. We have registered over 160 projects and have about another 120 listed, with many other additional projects under review for listing. There's also been a lot of growth in the state-level compliance markets in Mexico, which we're watching closely, and where applicable, working with the state governments to support the inclusion of reserve projects in their compliance markets, such as in the Querétaro carbon tax, as well as continuing to work with Semarnat, the Secretary of Environment, at the national level, as they continue to build their compliance market and support the voluntary market.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was such an exciting overview of the growth and expansion opportunities that we've had, not only in these regions, but specific sectors that the Reserve is working in as well. And I appreciate you giving nod too that the expansion is not only happening in the voluntary market, but compliance markets as well. And we're doing this in conjunction with the governments and communities on the ground, which is an extremely important facet of our work here at the Reserve. So given this expansion, what has driven these developments and how have they shaped the direction of the Reserve program?
It's a really interesting question, which I actually think goes back to our roots in the California compliance market and how we initially developed protocols with the perspective of building standardized protocols adapted to specific jurisdictions or country contexts. After developing our first protocols for the US, which were then used in the California compliance market, speaking back in the early 2000s. Our first protocol adaptations were then for Mexico starting back in 2008. I wasn't actually here at the time, But understanding how the process worked, I believe it was actually rather natural and logical for the reserve to essentially say, hey, if we're going to work in Mexico, we'd have to adapt our protocols to Mexico. In other words, what works in the US doesn't necessarily work in Mexico. What we then later further have learned, building off that same basic principle, is that what works in Mexico doesn't necessarily work in Panama or Guatemala or Argentina, etc. Really, protocols should, of course, first comply with internationally recognized basic principles of carbon accounting, permanence, additionality, verification, etc., but also take into account the local context and be aligned with the laws and norms and common practices of that context in order to have standardized additionality tests and baselines and to incorporate appropriate social safeguards that align with the land tenure and governance structures in the jurisdictions. So ejidos in Mexico have different processes compared to comarcas in Panama or communities in Guatemala. We can better facilitate the inclusion of these actors and ensure their participation and ultimate benefit from the projects by taking into consideration and, when needed, building upon their decision-making processes, governance structures, and already established means of ensuring free, prior, and informed consent. Getting back to your initial question, though, I genuinely think the growth in the region has been quite organic, building off the lessons learned and the initial adaptations, and engaging with actors and the new jurisdictions. As the director of Latin America, I love to say this was all part of some grand vision that I or the team had mapped out years ago, but truly it happened through years of building connections in different jurisdictions, explain the rigor and processes of the reserve program and protocols, and the model we built in Mexico, seeing the growth and involvement of the communities and heroes there. And through that, we started to have conversations with people, organizations, governments from various different jurisdictions that were interested in replicating what we did in Mexico and their country.
Thank you, Amy. That's really inspiring to hear you speak about the growth that we've had in these regions, especially given the lens that what works in one region might not work for another region. And that's why it's so important to hold up these local context clues for these organizations and regions while also upholding the principles that we hold here at the reserve, like you mentioned, additionality and permanence and so on. So you've given nod to our work, of course, in these various countries. So, looking at that country context, how does the reserve work specifically with local stakeholders in Latin America and Caribbean region to ensure that projects are benefiting local communities and ecosystems?
Right. This is, of course, critical. First, we can't be experts in the laws and land tenure structures, common practices of every sector and every jurisdiction in the region, or at least not initially. We're working on it, right? So we have to build strong relationships with collaborators and experts in each jurisdiction we work in. We, of course, try to engage with the governments from each jurisdiction, particularly if there are potential compliance markets, either established or in the works, to make sure our protocols would support the climate objectives of the local governments. Also, more generally, to ensure we have a strong understanding of the legal framework and any relevant laws or regulations. And for nature-based solutions protocols or forest protocols, we'd also seek to include representation from a landowners, which in Latin America are often, of course, the local communities or indigenous groups. As I mentioned, having an understanding of those governance structures is essential to developing applicable and effective social safeguards, but also understanding how to best include these critical actors in the project design, development, implementation, etc. For example, in the development of the Panama Forest Protocol, we had a pretty extensive discussion about the channels of communication within the comarcas in order to appropriately consider how to ensure free, prior, and informed consent and ongoing communication and participation in practice. It's one thing for us to simply just say or put in the protocol that you must have free, prior, and informed consent. It's more important to really understand how that will be achieved, taking into account how these communities regularly communicate.
Thank you, Amy. That's super helpful. And you've hit on free, prior, informed consent, which is such a critical principle that we include within our protocols and working with these communities. And it's really essential in building relationships with these jurisdictions. So thank you for sharing that. And in working with local stakeholders and these organizations and governments on the ground, I'm sure there's many conversations that have been had about what's on the horizon for this region as well. So I'm wondering if you can share any emerging trends or opportunities that you see for Latin America and Caribbean.
For sure. There's a lot of exciting growth in a number of markets in the region: Chile, Argentina, Colombia, Ecuador, others. So we continue to monitor these developments and assess opportunities for the reserve and where we can make the greatest impact. We are a small team, though, so we look to be strategic where we engage moving forward. As previously mentioned, we also look to work closely with organizations or government agencies in each jurisdiction to really assess the need or demand for specific protocols. I think in 2025, it's likely we'll launch one or two new protocols in new jurisdictions, but we're also really looking to make sure that already established protocols are being sufficiently supported. When we started working in Mexico, this is back in, again, 2010, 2014, building from there, we held a number of in-person trainings all over Mexico, looking to build capacity within organizations and directly with the ejidos or communities to support project development and participation with the communities and ejidos. That was highly effective and created great results, but it also took a number of years. And sometimes that's what it needs, right? Time can only provide these wonderful results sometimes, but we're certainly looking to build from that, applying lessons learned and scale in the new jurisdictions a bit faster. So we're holding bi-weekly calls with potential project developers or interested stakeholders in both Guatemala and Panama to support them in assessing project eligibility and respond to any critical questions they might have as they go through developing the projects. We're also looking for other opportunities to engage with those actors and support project update. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, Mexico is always growing, which again is very exciting. But we also continue to emphasize the need to ensure quality project reviews, project support, and ongoing capacity building, and regularly assessing the protocols to make sure they are as rigorous and robust as possible to generate the real environmental and social benefits. We, of course, are looking forward to these protocols.
Absolutely, Amy. And that's really key to our programs here at the Reserve is that protocols are not built overnight. And we do want to have the greatest impact that we can have, but we do prioritize this quality of our protocols over quantity, let's say. And that is always going to be supported by having these robust conversations with communities and helping build capacity and having the trainings that you and the team facilitate on the ground in these regions, which is really all exciting and imperative to our work to build this critical program in Latin America. So thank you for sharing that. And looking across regions and opportunities, and there are many individuals and organizations that are looking to jumpstart and get their foot in the door in the Latin American Caribbean region. So I'm wondering, what advice would you offer to organizations and individuals that are looking to get involved with Climate Action Reserve or our programs or generally in Latin America?
To reach out, we're always happy to talk to new organizations or individuals interested in working with the Reserve. You can find our emails on the website. Mine is acessler@climateactionreserve.org, or reach out via LinkedIn, WhatsApp, however works best for you, right? English or Spanish, just reach out. If you're interested in adapting a new protocol to a new jurisdiction, there are specific forms you can fill out to submit the new protocol concept. You can find those on our website. Of course, again, if you have any questions about that process, reach out. As I mentioned earlier, we also have the biweekly calls for Guatemala and Panama. You can contact us to join those. It's really open to any interested stakeholder in those jurisdictions or in other jurisdictions that are interested in working within those jurisdictions or understanding those protocols. We also have weekly calls for all stakeholders interested in the Mexico Forest Protocol. So those are attended heavily by the project developers, but also the project coordinators. Project coordinators are the community representatives of those projects. So they're, again, just ongoing capacity building for those actors. Those are in Spanish in order to ensure these community members can join. But, you can join, and hopefully for those non-Spanish speakers, if you have any questions, let me know. And yeah, there are a number of other communication pieces you can explore at our website. Of course, sign up for the newsletter. It's both in English and Spanish. Follow us on social media. There's really a number of good options. But I'll return to my first point, which is, again, just don't be afraid to reach out.
Thank you so much, Amy. And I think that's really unique of our organization is our openness and willingness to really speak to anybody that's wanting to get involved with our programs and provide these critical resources so that they can feel prepared to enter the carbon market and create carbon projects with Climate Action Reserve. So, Amy, I really appreciate all of your time and your insights today in highlighting these expansion opportunities into the region and truly look forward to the future of this program with you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. It's been a pleasure and it's wonderful getting to highlight all this great work. It's really work of an entire team, of course, but also in collaboration with so many people, organizations, actors across the region. So thank you to everyone that works with Reserve. And yeah, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Amy. Appreciate it.